All right, so thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome. We're really excited to host this panel. We're very happy to have you all with us. And we anticipate a robust conversation in which we are all taking part. So thanks for being in this virtual room with us today. I was mentioning before we started the meeting, and I've been thinking about this in each panel that we've hosted over the last 2 days about how positive this feels, how valuable it is, and it's such a valuable reminder about how important these conversations are, that we have them all day long when we're on campus together, that now when we're apart, that we come back together and we refresh ourselves intellectually and somewhat emotionally. This feels like a really strong pushback to me against the inertia and the despair and the confusion about the current situation, to try to pick up some of the work and move forward. So we're grateful to have you here today. So in this session, we will use what are becoming normal Zoom protocols. We'll just ask everyone to be muted, which we all are, unless it's our turn to speak. We have Dr. Jeanette Kohl here, who you all know, who is serving as the respondent to the session. And we have Chloe Millhauser and Rebekkah Hart as our panelists today. We talked before the meeting and we agreed that Jeanette would say a few words, and then we would hear from Rebekkah and then Chloe. Then we'll hear a response from Jeanette that'll start us off on a conversation in which we're hoping to open it up to this room and begin to develop some of the ideas together. So you can use the chat window if questions occur to you as we go along and you think it's easier for you to just note them there instead of trying to remember them as you're listening. Or as I said, we can wait to the end and we can vocalize those questions together and try to explore them together. All right, without further ado, Jeanette, you have the podium.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Good seeing you. Some of you chiming in from as far as London, I see. Hello, colleagues, students, friends. Great to have you here. This is the first time I'm doing this, so I don't really know what I'm going to do except for what I'd do if I didn't have this screen in front of me. Anyways, I'm going to keep it sweet and short. We're having two great talks in our art history panel today, one by Rebekkah Hart and one by Chloe Millhauser. And Catherine already explained how this goes. I'm going to introduce both of them. They will give their talks, and after that, we'll try and get a discussion going together, I hope. So let's start with Rebekkah, if that's okay, Rebekkah? All right. So Rebekkah Hart is a first-year master's student in our program, the History of Art at UC Riverside, and she's focusing on the late medieval and early Renaissance periods in England. She has an interest in pedagogy, and that interest has led her to teach art outreach programs, amongst them the Gluck Fellowship Program this year, and to work in museum education, for example, at the Brigham Young University Museum of Art. Rebekkah's research has led her to spend semesters abroad in two hugely different countries, such as the UK and Italy. Returning to the UK, she studied Alabaster with a research grant award from Brigham Young University. And this year, Rebekkah will advance her research on English alabasters as the 2020-21 recipient of the Richard G. Carroll Travel Award. Congratulations, Rebekkah, and the podium is all yours.
Thank you so much. All right. Can you see my mouse? Yes. Great. Beginning in the first half of the 14th century, England's booming alabaster trade produced high-status tomb effigies, as well as a wide range of religious imagery that proliferated throughout England and was even shipped abroad. Among the most common of these religious images were rectangular panels of the decapitated head of St. John the Baptist on a charger, nearly 100 of which survive today. This particular iconography refers to the biblical episode of St. John the Baptist's beheading. After the prophet speaks out against the unlawful marriage of Herod's sister, named Herodias, she conspires against him with her daughter, Salome. Salome dances in front of Herod at a feast, pleases him, and is granted a favor. Salome asks for the head of John the Baptist on a charger, as planned with Herodias. Herod orders the executioner to behead John and to bring his head on a charger to Salome, who in turn presents the gory offering to Herodias. The iconography of the prophet's severed head, especially in the middle of a charger or platter, was common throughout Europe in the 14th to 16th centuries. The German loanword Johannesschüssel, literally St. John's platter or charger, refers to this larger pictorial genre. The English alabaster Johannesschüsseln can be differentiated from their continental counterparts by their standardized style. The hair is highly stylized and strictly symmetrical. The composition follows a general structure, and the tablets are invariably carved from alabaster in a rectangular form. In all cases, the isolated head of St. John the Baptist looms in the center of a round charger, usually with the eyes and mouth half open. The pale, waxy flesh of polished alabaster is surrounded by a halo of hair that is often gilded, but sometimes painted brown or brownish-orange. The details of the face are enhanced only by the slightest use of polychromy, black in the eyes, red in the lips, and sometimes red in the common gash above the left eye, a feature that will soon be explored in more detail. The dish behind the head is always round, usually with a prominent carved or painted border, and in some cases even has an inscription, as can be seen in this example reading Caput si Johannes Baptiste I Disco. While the figures surrounding the dish on all sides vary, a key feature at the bottom of the composition denotes two standard combinations or iconographical types that exist in varying complexity. Almost half of the surviving heads are of this iconographical type, characterized by the Agnus Dei directly below the charger. The Agnus Dei is the emblem of St. John the Baptist, as well as the symbol for the body of Christ. Echoing the Baptist's famous words, Ecce Agnus Dei, behold the Lamb of God. A banner comes from the Lamb that was almost certainly inscribed with this phrase. St. John the Baptist was venerated as the forerunner to Christ, and specifically as a forerunner to the Eucharist, when his head is presented at a feast. In fact, John's entire phrase, Ecce, behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world, is uttered aloud by the priest celebrating Mass at the moment he shows the Eucharistic bread to the faithful. Hence, these heads carry an overtly Eucharistic theme. The other half of the surviving heads shows the Man of Sorrows in place of the Agnus Dei. This is a more direct symbol of Christ, depicting him unclothed and half inside the tomb, displaying his wounds. Christ's arm and hand position as the Man of Sorrows is rarely the same in any panel of this type, as can be seen in these examples, although all positions highlight his wounds. Significantly, Christ never makes the blessing gesture, suggesting an emphasis on Christ's death and passion. The number of saints and angels surrounding the charger adds greater or lesser complexity to these two basic iconographic programs. In nearly all cases, angels occupy the upper register of the composition, with two of them aiding the saint's ascending soul in a cloth or mandorla. At least two saints usually surround the dish, St. Peter on the proper right, who can often be identified by the keys or the papal tiara, and a bishop on the proper left, who is tentatively assumed to be St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury. Additional saints are often placed in the scene and are sometimes identifiable by their displayed attributes, such as St. Catherine, seated on the proper left here, or the Virgin and Child, seated on the proper right. Most panels only have 6 to 8 figures, making this a particularly crowded example. Some surviving St. John's heads altogether omit any flanking saints, such as this panel. According to Francis Cheetham, the foundational scholar and cataloger of English alabasters, the compositional and iconographical complexity of these St. John's heads does not necessarily denote a chronological progression. Little is known about the dating of these heads, and Cheetham's catalog labels them as 15th century or late 15th century. The earliest textual evidence we have for a St. John's head is 1432, and the production of St. John's heads was allowed to continue all the way until 1550, some 15 years after Henry VIII banned religious images. Household inventories, wills, and other documents indicate that St. John's heads were found in private bedrooms, halls, and living rooms, as well as in private and parish churches. These documents even reveal that the heads were sometimes kept in cloth that is described as being brightly colored with lettering or the image of St. John. Some of these St. John's heads are also described as being kept in wooden housings, 5 of which have survived. This St. John's head in the Burrell collection in Glasgow is a remarkably well-preserved example, still in its original wooden tabernacle. Significantly, this Man of Sorrows is just as prominent in the composition as the head of St. John, if not more so. This furthers the idea that Christ's body, death, and passion, as well as the real presence in the Mass, are at the forefront of iconographical interest. Such emphatically spare use of polychromy on these English St. John's heads is startling, especially considering the visual culture of late medieval and early Renaissance Britain, with its predominance of brightly colored polychromed sculpture. The flesh of St. John's face is the highly polished surface of translucent alabaster, with only the slightest painted clarifications for features. The dish is also largely unadorned, and even some figures' clothing is only polished stone. Scholars have commented on this phenomenon of so little polychromy and so much bare alabaster, although it remains unexplored. This phenomenon is what generates my line of inquiry. Why is the use and display of luminescent alabaster so pronounced in this unique genre of St. John's heads, and what implications could this have for the sculpture's meaning and reception? Beginning such an exploration requires imagining how devotees would interact with these objects, specifically in the home where many of these resided. In the confines of a private bedroom, a hall, or a living room, the worshiper may have opened a brightly polychromed wooden tabernacle, or unwrapped a colorful cloth to reveal a pale, still head. Perhaps especially as seen by natural light streaming from a window, the glow of a fire, or the flickering of a candle, the translucent stone resembles human flesh, thus inviting flesh-to-flesh contact between the living and material worlds. Alabaster's unique translucence sets it apart from similar stones like marble, lending itself particularly well to imitating flesh. Not only does polished alabaster look remarkably like flesh, but it also feels flesh-like. In comparison to maybe the more familiar marble, alabaster's polished surface is slightly waxy and softer to the touch, and it even warms quicker to the touch. Among the bright colors of printed cloth and painted wood, the starkly bare face of polished alabaster is at the center of the worshiper's intimate interaction, both visually and even tactily. As the stone is brought to the forefront of the object and of the experience, it necessarily brings with it significant religious, political, and cultural associations to affect and produce meaning. Alabaster's religious connotations mainly stem from its prominent role in a biblical episode. Just before Passover, Christ sits at meat with his apostles when a woman traditionally identified as Mary Magdalene enters the room. As Mark reads, "There came a woman having an alabaster box of ointment of spikenard very precious, and she brake the box and poured it on his head." Christ explains that the woman hath wrought a good work in anointing him for his imminent burial. This woman's work has been honored and expounded upon in theological exegesis throughout the centuries by St. Jerome, St. Augustine, and many others. To summarize, these authors saw the alabaster container as a devotional metaphor and suggested that the woman represents the church, the alabaster vessel represents the human body, and the oil indicates the confession of faith. The broken alabaster vessel can also represent the body of Christ on the cross. The analogy of the alabaster vessel as a body naturally extended to the uncorrupted bodies of martyrs, as in the case of St. Trudbert, the knight of Christ who, having broken the alabastron of his body, spilt the precious oil of his blood and is venerated in the church as a martyr. This imagery of the human body as alabaster was also used as a devotional exercise. St. Alred of Rivaux encouraged the worshiper to take the place of Mary Magdalene and to break then the alabaster of your heart, and whatever devotion you have, pour it all out upon your bridegroom's head, while you adore the man in God and the God in man. How much more effective this exercise becomes as it is physically realized, when the worshiper can reverently touch smooth, flesh-like alabaster as they imagine their own stony hearts offered to God in exchange for a heart of flesh. This entreaty to ponder the man in God and the God in man is aided by the emphatically corporeal Christ represented by the Man of Sorrows, or the overall emphasis of Christ's body with the Agnus Dei. The popular comparison of alabaster to the bodies of the faithful, and especially to martyrs, is particularly applicable to St. John the Baptist, who is the foremost martyr. He goes directly before Christ as a type and a shadow to prepare the way for Christ's ultimate sacrifice by breaking the alabastron of his body and spilling the precious oil of his blood. In addition to religious associations, alabaster has political connotations that Rachel Dressler recently pointed out in her article exploring alabaster's rise to popularity. Dressler compellingly makes the case that a critical factor in the material's increased usage is the 100 Years' War with France from roughly 1337 to 1453. A growing sense of Englishness and a culture distinct from their Francophone neighbors began to emerge and take shape as conflict grew and raged. This phenomenon is well attested to in scholarship over the last 20 years, and in her review of English Mappa Mundi, a prominent theme surfaces of Britain as a bountiful land rich in natural resources. Many textual sources shed light on this idea, including Pliny's Natural History, which refers to Britain as Albion, derived from the Latin term albus, meaning white. John Trevise's translation of Higgins' Polychronicon also uses the term. First, this land was called Albion from its white rocks. Dressler suggests that alabaster, with its characteristic glowing whiteness abundant in fertile British soil, is easily associated with these white but otherwise nondescript rocks central to the island's identity. Alabaster's close association with the island continued to cultivate an English identity inside and outside England as it was shipped abroad. English alabaster was distinct from alabaster quarried elsewhere on the continent, and there even seems to be some preference for the English variety, thus closely linking the stone with the island. In addition, the growing English practice of using English alabaster for tomb effigies may have initially begun in emulation of the French marble tomb effigies in Saint-Denis, but seems to have evolved into competition as a growing English identity sought for a native stone. Dressler's assertion that the use and associations of alabaster being connected to hostility with France and a growing sense of distinct English identity are particularly relevant for the case of St. John's heads because of their connection with the Amiens relic of the Baptist's head. The relic of St. John the Baptist's head was previously held in Constantinople and brought to Amiens in 1206 as a result of the Fourth Crusade, soon becoming one of the most popular pilgrimage sites. However, claims to conflicting relics of the Baptist's head quickly multiplied and reached an absurd number of at least 13 competing churches by the end of the 16th century. The Amiens relic, on the other hand, was actually a visible skull, earning it the general consensus of being the most authentic relic. Adding to the skull's veracity is a puncture, just above the brow, which supposedly alludes to a legend of Herodias angrily mutilating the decapitated head. This was also explained as a Eucharistic parallel to Christ's wound on his side. The brow wound figures prominently in many English St. John's heads, and scholar Isabel Stoiber suggests a direct link between these and the Amiens relic. In 1392, John of Gaunt presented a jeweled reliquary head of St. John to the Cathedral of Amiens in an effort to placate the people under British rule in Picardy. Stoiber suggests that the Englishmen sent to Picardy to present the reliquary probably returned to York with souvenirs of the relic's shrine, such as pilgrimage medallions portraying that wounded head. Thus, the brow wound common in these English St. John's heads acts as a mark of authenticity in connection to the famous Amiens relic, in addition to underscoring a Eucharistic theme. Because of the immense efforts to keep Picardy and other parts of France under English rule, this iconography could be seen as being appropriated by the English, claimed in a decidedly English style, and represented in a distinctly English stone. Relic worship goes beyond the iconographical interest of these St. John's heads and accounts for the widespread worship of St. John's head on a platter. At the major pilgrimage site of Amiens, pilgrimage badges were sold en masse to ensure the protection of St. John. The protective and curative powers attached to these medallions and to the relic itself were reflected by many miraculous healing events ordained by St. John. Epilepsy, known as the sickness of St. John, was the most common cure reported, probably stemming from the tradition that Salome and Herodias were punished with epilepsy. Head ailments were also commonly healed, as were throat aches, fevers, hemorrhages, and even melancholy. One example tells of pilgrims suffering from head pain who would travel to Plesnitz in Carinthia, where a Johannesschlüssel had been reportedly found in the ground. Pilgrims would place their hats on the sculpture, invoke the aid of St. John, and be remarkably cured when they replaced the hats on their own heads. Healing miracles fueled the popularity of St. John's head's relics and the production of Johannesschlüsseln. The notion of healing became inextricably linked with the visual of St. John's head on a platter, and the sculptures came to represent a substitute presence as the miracle-working head. Significantly, a myriad of healing properties is also associated with alabaster, dating as far back as ancient Egypt. Many authors from antiquity, including Pliny, listed alabaster's medicinal qualities along with its other natural traits. Pliny reports that it cures affections of the mouth and teeth, and many other authors write about its use in plasters and ointments. Early Christian and medieval writing built upon these texts and added new powers to the stone. In the Peterborough lapidary, alabaster is said to be good for all manner of sores in the foot or in the knee when ground, mixed, and drunk with vinegar. Bald's Leech Book, an influential medical treatise from 900, provides an especially insightful passage claiming that alabaster has power against stitch and against flying venom and against all unknown afflictions. You must scrape it into a liquid and drink so much of it, and scrape it into a quantity of red earth, and the stones are all very good to drink from against all unknown things. When the fire is struck from the stone, it is good against lightning and thunderbolts and every kind of sorcery. If a man is misled in his way, let him strike one spark from it in front of him, and he will soon be corrected. The terms of use are rather precisely spelled out, and a number of curative powers are listed, perhaps most significantly, its power against all unknown afflictions or things. Thus, alabaster is made into a panacea, capable of healing all mysterious ailments. In addition to this expansive power, even magical capabilities are now attributed to the stone, so that it works against sorcery and can correct misled paths. Bartholomeus Anglicus also adds that the stone helpeth to win victory and mastery, and generates and preserves friendship. Albertus Magnus clarifies that because of its marvelous power, alabaster is placed among precious stones. Alabaster's far-reaching powers, most especially those that heal a broad range of ailments, parallel the curative powers of St. John the Baptist's head relics and Johannesschlüsseln. English alabaster St. John's heads augment the ever-present idea of healing by using and emphasizing the all-powerful stone. Even the way in which alabaster is commonly used, being ground into a powder and orally consumed, parallels the central theme in Johannesschlüsseln. The Baptist's head was offered on a platter like a victual and associated with Herod's feast, prefiguring the Eucharistic host that is consumed to heal and renew the spirit of the penitent. The devotees' association of healing with ubiquitous St. John's head is amplified by the exposed alabaster that is so powerful in its raw form, as they worship Christ, the Master Healer, and his renewing sacrifice. This brief exploration of the religious, political, and medicinal associations of alabaster suggests that the stone itself carried meanings in 15th and 16th century England. The distinctly English stone, with its power to heal all ailments and its central role in devotional metaphors, adds nuanced meaning to the ubiquitous devotional image of St. John's head that was present all over Europe but fashioned in a decidedly English style. The intentional exposure of alabaster in St. John's heads brings this wide range of meanings and associations to the forefront of these objects, which in turn interact with other materials, iconographies, and histories to affect and produce meaning. Thank you.
Great, thank you. How do we clap? Do we unmute?
I can see all the clapping.
All right.
Thank you.
Clapping. Okay, this was great. There's plenty to discuss afterwards, but we agreed to have the talks first. So I'm moving on to Chloe, who's sitting next to me on the virtual screen here on my left. Chloe Millhauser is, like Rebekkah, a first-year master's student studying European avant-garde photography again, in the History of Art department at UC Riverside. And like Rebekkah, she has a strong pedagogical interests, which have led her to a variety of outreach positions. For example, this year she taught elementary school students about I find this intriguing, about the improvisational paintings of Wassily Kandinsky as a 2019-20 Gluck Fellow. She's excited to continue providing arts education to the broader Riverside community in her upcoming position as a UCR Upward Bound instructor for the summer of 2020. And today she's going to talk about Menacing Banality, examining the uncanny in Neue Sachlichkeit still life photography. Please.
Thank you, Jeanette. Thanks everyone for coming as well. Let me get this set up. All right, is that showing? Yes, okay, cool. Since the movement's nascency in the interwar period, scholars have relegated the photographic works of the Neue Sachlichkeit to a position of apolitical regressivity. In a world marked by the searing trauma of World War I and its resulting political conflicts, Walter Benjamin viewed the Neue Sachlichkeit photographer's embrace of a seemingly beautified reality, sterilized from all contemporary traumata, as a veritable erasure of said horrors, a bourgeois attempt to reify the world as whole once more. Then, some 50 years later, art historian Benjamin Buchloh posited that the reductive realism of Neue Sachlichkeit works oriented the genre as a nebulous progenitor of German fascism. Though it is impossible to release all Neue Sachlichkeit photographers from these accusations, I argue that a revisitation to these images is imperative. Prior scholarship has largely focused on the monolithic traits of the genre, modeling much of its criticism on the works of Albert Rangerpach. I suggest an alternative mode of study, shifting our attention to Gerda Leo and Ayana Biermann, two lesser-known Neue Sachlichkeit participants. Leo and Biermann's still-life photographs appear initially benign. They are seemingly pensive yet beautifying images of banal object clusters which outwardly reflect those conservative Neue Sachlichkeit tendencies Benjamin and Buchloh refer to. However, I will attempt to prove that there is a strange slippage of reality that occurs within these photographs. They are not quotidian images regressive in their charms. Rather, when viewed through the theoretical lens of the uncanny, these images begin to decay during the process of sustained looking, transforming the depicted objects into malignant entities which threaten to sap the agency of the viewer, subjugating him beneath the newly empowered image object. Take, for example, Leo's 1929 photograph, Basket Weave. The depicted baskets brim with their own subjectivity. Meandering reeds snap back and forth in a dance of tight control and violent organization. Every individual reed is stressed with delicate mechanical tension as it exits the matrix of the basket and then turns and pierces the superstructure of the vessel once more. Stark lighting from the left contours the reeds with a distinct tenebrism, emphasizing every manipulation of each reed away from its original straight character. The quick thatching of the outermost reeds tightly grasps the vertical reeds that constitute the inner armature of the basket, like a hand clutching a stick. Positioned behind the round basket is an additional rectilinear basket which occupies the remainder of the picture plane. The tightly coiled fibers of the second basket stitch the four segments of the basket together, creating four diagonal seams. These seams, if extrapolated out behind the foreground basket, meet at an X in the center of the photograph. This central X acts as an eye, piercing through the round basket and confronting the viewer with mirrored vision. The three visible outer branches of the central X frame the foreground basket, but their diagonality, along with the tilted quality of the foreground basket, upsets the horizon of the pictorial space. The camera apparatus is positioned such that the baskets confront the human viewer, tilting simultaneously left and up as if to press through the pictorial space and intrude into the viewer's world. In their uppermost right-hand corner of the photo, a small triangular shadow cuts across the further basket. Though the entity precipitating the shadow exists beyond the bounds of the photograph, we are apt to assume that it is another basket. The viewer no longer consumes and acts upon the static imagery of the baskets, but rather is drained of agency and enveloped into the world of the baskets. Baskets fold up and around the viewer, encasing her in a foreign realm of uncertainty and claustrophobia. As such, the baskets cease to be simply the quotidian products of human manufacturing and prosaic usage. Instead, they flicker, verging on the unrecognizable while maintaining a tenuous grasp on normalcy. Sigmund Freud's 1919 essay, The Uncanny, is the best-known treatise on the subject. However, for the purposes of this investigation, I am more interested in the theories of Freud's predecessor, Ernst Jentsch. Freud and Jentsch agree on the general definition of the uncanny, noting that, in Freud's words, the uncanny belongs to the realm of the frightening, of that what evokes fear and dread. The source of this fear and dread is not outright, but arises instead from subtle means. The uncanny reveals itself in the brief yet misplaced recognition of a friend's features in the countenance of a stranger, or when the unfocused gaze into a lush nighttime forest coalesces the delicate filigrees of foliage into a vaguely human form. As Freud states, the uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. Jentsch, in his 1906 work on the psychology of the uncanny, prioritizes theories of animation within his study, which I find particularly helpful in complicating my readings of Neue Sachlichkeit imagery. In his text, Jentsch identifies one scenario that incites a fairly regular, powerful, and very general sensation of the uncanny. This he describes as doubt as to whether an apparently living being is animate, and conversely, doubt as to whether a lifeless object may not in fact be animate. For this concept, Jentsch offers the example of a traveler who sits down in an ancient forest on a tree trunk and that, to the horror of the traveler, this trunk suddenly begins to move and shows itself to be a giant snake. The inconclusiveness of the animate qualities of the inanimate frames my methodological investigation of Neue Sachlichkeit works through the lens of the uncanny. One can argue that Neue Sachlichkeit works that contain inanimate subjects, as well as those that depict the human form, both elicit the sense of the uncanny. Generally, this inference is true. A face may seem unsettlingly familiar, or a smile may appear tinged with the qualities of a more malicious feeling. However, in his discussion of the doubt generated by confounding the animate qualities of entities, Jentsch concludes that the uncanny is most piercing when this doubt only makes itself felt obscurely within one's consciousness. We tend to inherently trust the stability of things. The inanimate object, for instance, seemingly exists within the domain of our own agency. Specifically, it is the objects that constitute a still life, having been arranged by a human actor and thus removed from the precarities of chance, which appear to exist only as objects of human subservience. It is these depictions of the inanimate which may initially seem so benign and within human control, but that transform with astonishing plasticity into entities that are menacing in their unfamiliarity. The Neue Sachlichkeit still life thus constitutes the ideal canvas for a study predicated upon the uncanny. In conducting this investigation, I have realized that there are several perspectival motifs which consistently produce a sense of the uncanny within Leo and Biermann's photographs. Among them is the distortion affected by the use of the tight shot. The close-up forces confrontation between viewer and object, accentuating the presence of the object when it would have otherwise been relegated to the realm of ambiance or scenery. Ayana Biermann's cactus, for example, ceases to exist as background foliage. Instead, the viewer encounters the plant as though it were at eye level. The curving spines of the plant no longer seem playful nor exotic. Rather, they become an object of intimidation and disgust. Though they are moving in photographic depiction, they recall imagery of writhing insect parts and appear to almost reach out towards the viewer, eliciting distinct unsettlement. Similarly, Biermann's Alabaster seems less an object of human sustenance and more akin to the gnarled countenance of a bellicose stranger. The proximity to the camera causes the claw to appear in equal proportion to a human head, personifying the object and imbuing it with nascent subjectivity. Rather than integrating seamlessly into a quotidian background, the objects become independently significant and mirror the form of the human viewer. In this way, the depictions of the close-up objects become more akin to portraits than to traditional notions of still life. The objects thus unsettle us, in the words of art historian Megan Luke, because they show how independent they are from us, existing in a universe quite apart from one where we might imagine human life to be the leading protagonist. The close-up object appears to watch the human just as the human observes the object, denaturing its inanimate qualities and transforming it into an entity that appears almost eerily animate. The object no longer fits solidly into the category of inanimate, but it is also not entirely animate either. It threatens animation while maintaining the stillness of inanimation. Thus, the object depicted in the close-up flickers, vacillating quickly between two states, never offering a distinct answer on its essence to the human viewer. This interstitiality is particularly effective in generating the uncanny. Paradoxically, however, the very nature of the close-up photograph simultaneously conceals and creates the uncanny. Though the viewer may feel elements of uncertainty entwined in the viewing experience, the detailed confrontational nature of the tight shot also serves as a distraction. The eye is led astray, tempted by grotesque, intimate, and superfluous detail. Thus, the details which constitute the image's superstructure mask the composition that is the superstructure. In Leo's basket weave, the sheer intricacy of the light playing across the basket's weaving matrices acts as a pretense. It masks the viewer's direct identification of animation within the proposed basket world. Filigrees of alternating light and dark lead the eye haphazardly about the image. One notices the mottled pinpricks of light piercing through the anterior of the round basket, then the subtle contouring of the braided basket rim. Appreciation of the delicate craftsmanship, illuminated by glowing sunlight, conceals the looming object confrontation and the more aggressive nature of the larger basket components. The magnification of detail occludes the eye from easily comprehending both the superstructure and substructure of the image simultaneously. Thus, the uncanny seeps in not in a flood of uncertainty, but as a more insidious trickle. Jentsch, in his examination of the uncanny in storytelling, states that uncertainty becomes infinitely more uncanny when the uncertainty does not appear directly as the focal point of the viewer's attention, so that the viewer is not given the occasion to investigate and clarify the matter straight away. The close-up teases the viewer, creating a seemingly endless series of red herrings of visual interest and snatches away the pith of the image, which generates the uncanny. The viewer is thus shuffled along through a fruitless exploration of details, unable to categorize and understand that what is making her so uncomfortable, so undeniably uncertain. In the close-up, the precipitator of the uncanny is also its own self-preserving and self-amplifying shroud. The subtle alteration of naturalistic perspective is additionally able to spawn the uncanny in otherwise prosaic imagery. For this, we look to Biermann's photograph, Broken Egg. Initially, the perspective with which Biermann shot Broken Egg seems to be an entirely veristic mimicry of everyday human perception. The camera apparatus looks down upon the egg, much like one would when preparing a meal. However, we must account for the commonly vertical nature of displaying two-dimensional work. Should Biermann's Broken Egg be hung from a wall, the perspective would cease to be naturalistic in any sense. Instead, the posterior parts of the egg would appear attached to the wall and thus project the egg horizontally out towards the viewer. Rather than existing in the service of the human actor, the egg parts meet the gaze of the viewer like a pair of bulging lacrimal eyes. Harsh shadows envelop the interior of the egg, implying a sort of aesthetic gravity and pulling the yolk downwards. The yolk sits lazily within its shell. It demurely peers out into the world and catches light on its glossy silken surface. Yolk and shell seem a nearly perfect union in tranquility. However, the shell, on its lower left-hand portion, bulges out like a dam overwhelmed by the force of water. Thus, the yolk threatens to ooze out of the confines of the shell, mirroring the nightmarish imagery of a horribly damaged eye. The egg no longer seems domestic and benign, but corporeal, visceral, and wounded. The empty shell top becomes a hollow socket whose oculus has been plucked out. Perspective provides the egg with an unnerving personification, recontextualizing it as a strangely humanoid object that is stridently uncanny. Occasionally, a departure from linear perspective within a Neue Sachlichkeit work manifests as reverse perspective, a decidedly less common viewpoint. Reverse perspective, in essence, works counter to its linear complement. Rather than converging down to a distant vanishing point on a horizon line, objects depicted in reverse perspective narrow towards the viewer, like the lines describing the table in this mosaic. Comparative linguist Devin Four notes that due to this perspectival switch, when viewing a painting that uses reverse perspective, the spectator has the discomforting sensation of being himself on view. Commonly employed in Byzantine and Russian icons to encourage the interaction of the viewer and the depicted entity, reverse perspective enjoyed a brief renaissance in the works of the European avant-garde. It would thus seem plausible that both Leo and Biermann would have been aware of the reemergence of this pictorial technique. Reverse perspective is difficult to execute in a strictly literal sense within photographic practice. However, I argue that nods to reverse perspective are hidden throughout many examples of Neue Sachlichkeit still life. Biermann's early 1930s photograph, Fruit Basket, alludes to reverse perspective through the form of the newspaper lining the basket. The fruits depicted within Fruit Basket sit heavily within their woven container and warp the newspaper lining. The weight of the pears and apples pulls the corner of the newspaper, which extends beyond the border of the photograph, away from the body of the newspaper. This tears the paper, creating an additional vertex in the newspaper's visible shape. Thus, the visible portion of the newspaper transforms from a simple triangle into a quadrilateral, more trapezoidal in nature. This trapezoidal shape mirrors a rectilinear form depicted in reverse perspective and subsequently extends the newspaper out towards the viewer. In this way, the newspaper constitutes a sort of bridge, connecting the space of the viewer with the depicted inanimate realm of the fruits. Additionally, reverse perspective works in direct conjunction with the disorienting oblique overhead angle that is so common within the oeuvres of both Leo and Biermann. When one looks at rectilinear forms depicted in reverse perspective, the uppermost face of the form tilts so that the viewer has a clear sight of whatever lays upon that top surface. In much Byzantine imagery, this perspectival shifting allows the viewer to take in an unobstructed view of the objects placed on the table, like the loaves of bread depicted here. In this way, reverse perspective prioritizes symbolic over naturalistic depiction, while simultaneously pushing the depicted objects closer to the viewer. The oblique overhead angle of the frontal basket within Leo's basket weave, for instance, mimics the tilting of a form in reverse perspective and causes the frontal basket to push outward beyond the bounds of the picture plane. Additionally, although the two baskets are created through differing modes of construction, basket weave, in essence, shows the viewer all aspects of the basket. The proximal basket shows the handle designed for easy carrying and the open interior space for placing one's goods, while the distal basket shows, in theory, what the bottom of the frontal basket could look like. In this way, basket weave becomes a pragmatic symbol of a basket, providing the viewer with a schematized model of a theoretical woven vessel. Thus, the juxtaposition of the tilted view of the frontal basket, combined with the straight view of the distal basket, acts as a form of reverse perspective in and of itself. The implementation of reverse perspective causes the symbolic multidimensional basket to look back at the viewer through its own exercise in didacticism. Through the close-up, manipulations of perspective, and the use of reverse perspective, the objects depicted in the still life photography of Leo and Biermann attains a certain subjectivity and sense of semi-animation. The objects no longer appear confined to the quotidian ranks of the inanimate, but rather morph into strange entities laced with uncertainty. They are simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar. That is, they are uncanny. The evocation of the uncanny pulls these photographs away from more classical realisms operating at the time and throws into doubt the very nature of the imagery that is conventionally accepted as benign. Leo and Biermann's still lifes do not illustrate a calm, idealized world. Instead, they present a world entrenched in ambiguity. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Great. It's up to me, and I have to start with an apology. In all of this, looking at all of the images, I forgot to introduce Rebekkah's talk by its title. So post factum comes the title, Decapitated, Alabaster, Exegesis, Medicine, and Tactility in English, Alabaster, St. John's Heads. I'm awfully sorry. Anyway, so thank you very much to both presenters. That was fabulous. I was a little concerned at the beginning when Catherine said, wrap this up together, because your topics are so hugely different. All the more am I surprised that there are a lot of parallels in a way. So you both spoke about the power of images and the life of objects in those very different contexts. And I have to say, I was quite impressed by the power of your innovative curiosity in finding out more by looking very closely, which I think is such a crucial and important part of the work that we do as art historians. So the ability of really looking and taking a second look and thinking twice, I think showed very, very nicely in both of your talks. And it's, in a way, you're in the footsteps of Aby Warburg. The devil is in the detail. So the uncanny is a category that I personally, although I'm far from being a photography expert, never would have put together with the photography of Neue Sachlichkeit, which carries factuality in its title. So I thought that was quite an interesting new spin on that movement and on the works of two artists in there in particular, but also the ingestion of parts of late medieval or early modern objects was not on my radar so much either. So nicely done, I think, for both of you in choosing those particular subject matters and topics for your MA theses. I have just, because this is closer to my field, I have, as an opening question, a question for Rebekkah, and then I'll open the discussion to everyone. So Rebekkah, in looking at those fabulous San Giovanni in disco objects, which exist in such a great number, I was, and you were talking about their encasements, not only their potential functions, but also that they might have been, or that they were wrapped in cloth, and then some of them were again encased in wooden boxes, more or less immediately, directly in touch with the alabaster. And I thought that this might be really part of a larger dramaturgy, a larger staging at work here, because some of the objects that you showed did show the act of unveiling, you know, with even the veil left on top of the disc, so that a situation of drama is shown, and then also the Man of Sorrows popping out of these sarcophagus-like pedestals, so that there is like a triple revelation or a triple drama of showing, if you want. And that's just an observation. My question is more about the use of these objects. So how do we have to picture this? How do we have to think about people having those in their hands, holding them in their hands, using tools, scraping off things, and then what, putting them in their drink?
So It's an interesting question there. Thank you for your question and your remarkable insights into unveiling as well, which will lead into some further things. But as far as the medicinal use of alabaster, this has been attested to again since ancient Egypt all the way through the 19th century. And we even have some 17th century pharmaceutical jars that have labels of stones on them. We have two particularly, one of emerald and one of sapphire, being kept right along with other herbals in pharmaceutical shops. So the use of medicinal stones was very common, and alabaster specifically because it could act as a base, it made itself so easily into flour. It was used particularly commonly because it could act as that base. And in the 18th century, we even have reports of people coming to cathedrals and to religious images and sculptures and scraping the alabaster off of these images, because it was thought that if it came from a religious image, if the alabaster came from a religious image, it would be even more effective. So there's even that layer of religious imagery enforcing the healing and the properties of curing even more. And so this, having existed also in the Middle Ages, the whole range of powers that is associated with alabaster took on almost every range of healing and powers beyond that. So considering how they would have scraped it into a powder and then used that powder as a salve or to consume orally, we have multiple instances that was happening. And then in the 18th century with religious images specifically.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. I'm looking at everyone here for your show of hands. Catherine, is that how we do it? Okay, Johannes, yes.
Hi, everyone. So I think you all know me. Otherwise, just send me an email and explain who I am. So I think it's God who is in the detail. Well, the devil is obviously everywhere. So thanks for both of your very inspiring talks. I have brief questions for both Rebekkah and Chloe. So Rebekkah, when we look at Johannes Schüssel, we also look, at least in your cases, in your examples, at an interesting shift or break of perspective. It is as if the Schüssel, the charger, would be presented to us as if it were lifted out of the image plane, right? In a way that is not in accordance with the perspectival regime of the relief itself, which of course reminds one of the presentation of the Eucharistic wafer or bread. And since you're interested in the materiality also of alabaster and its almost carnal qualities, I think you have there yet another connection to the Eucharist, right? And also questions of the transubstantiation of the flesh, which is supported, again, also by such backstories as it were, so on a perspectival level, at which one would probably not even expect such connections to be made. So my question is simply, does that make sense to you? My question for Chloe concerns I was waiting, of course, for Heidegger to surface. But that's okay. So I'm interested in the uncanny. So both Jentsch and Freud connect the uncanny to the blurring of the boundaries between human life and lifelessness. So their example is taken from Hoffman's Sandman, in which it is a mechanical doll, a female automaton, that appears to be alive. While in Neue Sachlichkeit, it seems as if this aspect of confusing the object with human lifelessness, human life likeness is rather put aside. So do we have to take into consideration such a differentiation? So human life versus life in general, the animate versus the inanimate, or am I misled?
Should I take this one first?
Sure.
Okay. So I feel as though, well, I focus specifically on Jensch's because I feel like his idea of what is animate versus inanimate is kind of broad in a way that allows me to explore the different qualities within the photographs more richly than Freud, who, as you said, derives most of his study from the Hoffman story, which is quite wonderful as well. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like it's important to kind of, in a sense, broaden what the inanimate is and what the animate is, such that the confusion of them can become more nuanced, if that makes sense.
All right, for your question for me, how interesting. I hadn't been thinking about perspective in those ways, and I'm so glad you bring it up because it brings up a lot of ways in which we have thought about these being displayed. One thing that comes to mind is a painting by, I believe it's Hans Memling, of the Virgin Mary praying in her room, and there is an alabaster of the Trinity on a shelf above the mantelpiece, as if it's watching over her and it's quite high above the mantelpiece. So that is one way in which we can think of these being displayed, maybe especially those that were in wooden tabernacles. And then we also have a print that shows, I believe it's from the late 15th century, that shows the St. John's head on a dish on the altar and slightly propped up at an angle, and everyone is knelt looking at it. And so there's also that idea of viewing it on the altar and not just flat and not just straight up like an altarpiece, but tilted as if bringing out its objectivity in that way more. And I think exploring that idea of perspective and the idea of the Eucharist as a host is something that I would love to look into more. Thank you for bringing that up.
Christopher.
I'm not used to unmuting myself. I was about to speak with it on, and gosh, I've been for the last 2 months, and I just talk whenever I want to, and people just I should apologize in retrospect. Put up with it. I have a question for each of you as well. And I'm going to ask Rebekah first, but I'll move straight on to Chloe afterwards. Your comment about the Memling painting set me up nicely. I am aware that I am speaking from a slightly different and possibly very different frame of reference, which is that I think of these sorts of things in terms of the Netherlandish production of these kinds of reliefs, more in the 16th century, although beginning earlier as well. I will leave Malcolm to talk about the English medieval production, which I'm sure he will do in great detail on the erudition. It's nice to see you, by the way, Malcolm. Private chat, but the only person that could privately chat was Catherine Henshaw, so I was spoiled. You spoke about the connection with France and with Amiens in particular. And I don't know to what degree these sorts of things were produced there, but there are lots of workshops in the Netherlands starting in the late 1400s, or at least the early 1500s, that produce these in quite a scale and send them out all over the place. Very often there are workshops that specialize in these sorts of things, and then they get their tabernacles or their wooden frames or whatever context it is from some local craftsman wherever it is that they go. And so I'm wondering about the degree to which, in the English context, the setting itself tells us something about the use in the local context of the user as an individual or as a family. And to what degree within the English context these things were produced on a fairly massive scale and sent around. One imagines that simply by comparing a big enough group of them, you can see how standardized they are, for example, that sort of thing. One other comment that actually I kept thinking of as you spoke about eating from these things, or eating actually the stone itself. It sounds very quaint and, oh, aren't those late medieval traditions entertaining? But it might also actually have been not based in nothing. I was thinking about it, a salt shaker in there full of pink Himalayan sea salt, which is basically a rock that you put in a shaker and you shake it on your dinner because it's tasty. In other cases, rocks are maybe one way that you get iron or other things that you actually do need. So it might not have been based entirely on nothing or on pure superstition. I don't know, but it was one thing that came to mind. For Chloe, I kept thinking, and as you were reading the basket in particular, I kept thinking about your reading of it as a very particular kind of reading, which is fine, but I kept thinking of it in relation actually to our discussion in seminar yesterday, where we had the three-way grudge match between Keith Moxie, Svetlana Alpers, and Hessel Miedema. And in the end, we had the question of the degree to which it is possible to speak about a standard historical interpretation for something that exists in any quantities. It's more possible if you're talking about one owner or one viewer or one context. I don't know what sorts of numbers of prints of these photos were made. So my first question for you is, are you proposing your own interpretation of your own reading of these photos, or are you proposing an historical interpretation of the way that somebody in the 1920s or 1930s would have seen it, and on how you get there if it is a more historical take? Are there reviews from exhibitions at the time that give you something to build on? Are there other ways, early biographies or diaries or something to work with? Or how do you get there? How do you make that jump from your reading to an historical reading, if that is what you are proposing to do? That is all. I will shut up now.
You can take it first, Chloe.
Thank you for your question, because yesterday during seminar, I was thinking the same thing actually, and I was a little bit afraid after reading some of the polemical conversations between different art historians. And so at this point, I'm proposing just my own reading. I would love to come upon something that would ground this in a historical context. I'm working on that currently, but I just feel that it's important to kind of nuance what we think of as Neue Sachlichkeit, because it seems as though the that kind of original, Walter Benjamin's original critique of it has just held steady since he made it. And it just seems to me that relegating all of these images to this theme of regressivity and conservatism gives fascism too much power in a sense, and that it just doesn't feel right to have them all categorized like that. And just knowing the backgrounds of some of the artists who participated in Neue Sachlichkeit, for instance, Ayana Biermann, she was a German Jewish woman. I can't imagine that she herself was, implicit in the theories that Walter Benjamin suggests for her. And so I'm trying to kind of reclaim these images in a sense from this categorization that I don't think is fair for them.
In terms of categorization, I was thinking, is there a particular preference for certain materials, a certain type of materiality, or a certain typology when you speak about the category of the uncanny, and the artists you're looking at? Are there types that you can identify of photographs within that larger topic, I mean?
I think specifically I'm finding the kind of the instances of the uncanny in the still life photos, just because they seem oddly not just kind of like your standard still life, at least to me. But I think it could extend to other forms of the Neue Sachlichkeit photography as well. I'm just focusing specifically on the still life for now, as I feel like it's the most easily grounded for me personally, and then I'm going to explore other subjects as well within it.
All right, I'm looking around.
I think I need to answer.
You answered the question.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. Thank you for your question, Chris. It's something that we wish we knew more about, the English production of St. John's heads, but we do know some. We know that there were alabasterers and alabastermen. As to what they did specifically, we're not entirely sure, although alabaster men seem to have at least been carving the alabaster. We also have image painters and image makers. And then we also seem to have a group of people that that would trade and take these heads around to be sold and to trade. And we even have one reference of a shipload of St. John's heads that was being taken to the continent, and it had 58 St. John's heads aboard, some in housings and some in not. So there's that, at least that bit of insight that there was multiple parts of the process to making these heads, and we would also assume that the wood was made separately and the cloth was made separately. In fact, we do have one reference that tells us that the cloth was sometimes more expensive than the St. John's head itself. And so the way in which those processes were broken up is unfortunately not completely clear, but we know that at least to that extent it was. And as far as the eating and the consuming of rocks, that's a very interesting thought, and something I need to look into more. But this was something, like I said, that was used as a salve and orally, and it was used in a lot of, for so many different things, that thinking about it specifically with food, such as salt, is an interesting, I think I would love to look into. So thank you for that.
I don't know if it'll lead you anywhere, but it was just something that crossed my mind.
Thank you.
All right, now I can ask. Susan, yes. I think you're still mute. I can't, okay.
Okay. Thank you both for two terrific talks. They were great. I, again, have a question for each of you. Rebekkah, and oddly for me, they're fairly historical questions. My question is, you mentioned early on about how the St. John's heads were still permitted 15 years into King Henry's reign when he had, and that would be 15 years after he broke with the church, right?
Right.
And I wonder if you'd speculate at all on why that might be. What was his interest in maintaining what seems to be an almost folk or superstitious grasp of these? He was a knowledgeable man. He wasn't that kind of superstitious, I don't think. Also, particularly given the heads, this is dopey, but given that St. John's head came off, and knowing, Henry VIII's history. So that's my question for you, Rebekkah. And Chloe, again, I wonder if you would speculate, like, one of the things that makes your project important is the fact that you've pulled out to virtually unknown women photographers who actually work quite a bit and really have the power to kind of turn this reception of Neue Sachlichkeit into something else, to turn it away from Rengerpach in a way and his bad history. So I'm curious whether there's anything about the work that you found that particularly speaks to gender, or whether you're going to step away from that. Your plan, are you going to step away from that and really just treat them as photographers in a nearly ungendered way?
Should I go first, or do you want to go first?
I'll take this one first. Okay, so thank you for your question. I'm glad you bring it up, because when we consider the story of St. John the Baptist and the story of Henry VIII, there are some rather interesting parallels. Also upset about unlawful marriages and taking drastic action to make things right, sort of puts Henry VIII on the same level as Herod, or even Herodias and Salome. And so it's especially interesting to note that in his own private collection, Henry VIII had 3 St. John's heads that were completely jeweled and immaculate. So it's a strange contradiction. And I would love to know why they continued till 1550. Part of the act that banned them in 1550 sort of seemed at the very tail end of things, but more than anything, it was against images that had become so widespread and gotten to the point where even after the ban of religious images, it simply couldn't continue anymore. But the fact that it went a whole 15 years longer than other things is something I'm still looking into, and I think holds specific significance for the popularity and the use of these.
Thank you.
And thank you for your question towards me as well. I think gender is so important in this investigation, and it is the next part of the study that I am very much looking forward to beginning, or continuing, I should say. Specifically because I feel as though the era in which these photographs were taken during the Weimar Republic is a time of a very shifting of gender roles within specifically German society, and kind of a new emancipated woman. And I feel like the images from both of these artists really begin to show that in a sense. They both have still life images, which is what I'm focusing on, which, you know, highlight those domestic objects of everyday existence. And then beyond that, they also have a lot of photographs that focus on kind of familial ties. There's a lot of family portraits specifically, and I'm interested in how that ties in as well. So to answer your question succinctly, yes, lots of gender coming soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shannon. Fantastic talk from both of you. It was really insightful. I have a question for both of you as well. Rebekkah, I really enjoyed your link of Alabaster to English society and the identity of the actual island itself. I thought that was really interesting. Similar to Johannes's question about perspective, the significance of the eyes and mouth half open, I was just hoping for some clarification on that and wondering if the positioning of the platter could be in link to that in some way. And then as for Chloe, I really enjoyed your analysis of the cropped composition and the tight shot. I was curious if you were aware of these photographers' creative process and their use of the harsh and dramatic lighting within their works.
Thank you, Shannon. The eyes and the mouth being half open The eyes, a lot of them have worn away. So the ones that have worn away, we're not sure exactly if they were painted all the way open or halfway open, but the ones that have survived, they're always half open. So we assume that most of them were that way. As for the mouth being half open, this is a common way to portray St. John the Baptist, because it signifies his role as the prophet coming right before Christ and prophesying to clear the way before Christ. So it's very common, not just in these St. John's heads, but in all iconographies of St. John the Baptist, to see him with his mouth half open. And in linking to perspective, that is something I have thought about, especially in the head perhaps being tilted up on an altar or all the way up in a wooden tabernacle. And I think, again, perspective is something I need to continue to look into, but I thank you for your insight. I would love to think about that along with Johannes's question.
And thank you for your question to me as well. I'm not entirely sure about the exact practices yet. I'm still looking into those, but from what I can tell, most of the photos are taken in natural lighting, or the kind of lighting that exists within an interior space. And I'm trying exactly to figure out the implications of that, whether that kind of alludes to, again, a kind of a domesticity or kind of a naturalness of the objects, or if sometimes there are objects that are illuminated by sunlight, but that seem very intense in their illumination. And I'm trying to figure out exactly what that means. And I haven't quite teased it out yet, but it's definitely something that I am excited to look into as well.
Malcolm, London calling.
Unmute.
Oh, sorry. I need to, oh dear. I'm unmuted. I'm now unmuted. So a toast to both of you, because here it's 9 o'clock or so. So I can have a
In
drink.
the evening, I hope.
What?
In the evening, I hope, I said.
Yes, very much so. So they were both fascinating. I have questions mainly for Rebekkah, but also a question, an idea for Chloe. For Rebekkah, actually, contrary to what Chris was saying, thinking I'd come from an English angle, I was thinking of the continental examples and the contrast with the continental examples, which are often in the form of actually a schlüssel, a dish with the head. So there's no surround. It's almost as if they're sort of objects that you handle. So in a sense, there's a much more directness. I'm just wondering, I'm not quite sure what one does with that, but so that was one question. The other was the whole, all the framework of the whatever liturgical practices there around St. John, but also miracle plays. I can't remember, but does St. John crop up in miracle plays, and might that give you some sort of way into thinking about how these things were seen and used? The other thing is, have you used the work of Caroline Bynum? Because there, the whole materiality and spirituality of the way they go together, I thought that perhaps you've already done that. So, and then for Chloe, this is sort of picking up on Susan's gender point in a way. The baskets, were baskets usually made by women? I'm thinking of the making of these things, and whether that would have been understood to be not only the use of baskets, but the actual making of them. And then following on from that, and this is going perhaps off too much of a tangent. I've now forgotten his name, but the anthropologist in Aberdeen who took his students in the middle of winter onto the beach in Aberdeen and got them to make baskets.
Oh.
He did this in order to show, to get them to sense the agency of the material. And you were talking about the animate and inanimate and so on, and I'm wondering whether that I don't think that's really necessarily very relevant. That's what I started thinking of when I saw these baskets. Wasn't really.
We read that article for the method
Yes,
seminar.
we did.
That's fine. Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
I can't remember his name. You can probably remember the name. I can't remember.
I can't. No.
Anyhow.
Well, thank you for your question. So I would assume that probably women were not hand making baskets at this time. I would assume that they're probably being made in a factory. And I don't know exactly how a machine would come into play in this, but I would assume that there was some mechanical component in creating the baskets of this time. Right. Though I think it's very important to know that the process of making baskets and kind of historically has been more of a feminine task, so to speak. And so I think that kind of speaks to the choice of photographing the basket then. So even though it's perhaps not an object specifically crafted by a woman or by any single person necessarily, that it comes from that tradition of kind of feminine work in a sense, right. I feel like is very important.
Good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Malcolm. And more than anything, thank you for being here. I know it's quite late for you, and we really...
Oh, no. It's a very nice time to do this, actually.
Well, as soon as I saw you on, I looked at what time it was in London, so thank you. I really appreciate your presence here. And for your questions, yes, Caroline Bynum is essential to what I'm doing as the paramount works on materiality and the approaches of materiality. Right. I'm looking at Caroline Bynum's work quite a bit. She also talks a lot about consumption, Holy Feast and Holy Fast, and right. It ties to the Eucharist, and that will surface and also build a foundation for a lot of what I'm doing in regards to that. The continental heads is something that I am continuing to look at in more detail. And you're right, what sets apart these English alabasters is that there's so much going on besides just the head. And I think, to me, right now, as I'm understanding it, that is really putting an emphasis on the Eucharistic emphasis and a theme of Christ's body and passion and the real presence in the Mass. Anna Maria Valcarl has even said that the face in a dish often also brings to mind Veronica's veil. Yeah. Which, going back to your question, Jeanette, makes me think of the multiple layers of unveiling that are going on. And so I think that's something I'm going to continue to look into. As for the miracle plays, this is probably the most researched aspect of St. John's heads, although not really since the 1930s, as most of the scholarship on this head is, or on these heads are. But there does seem to be a strong link between mystery plays and all of these English medieval alabasters, not just St. John's heads. However, it tends to be quite contentious in scholarship as to how much weight we really give to the mystery plays and their representations and how that should be incorporated to our understanding of the English medieval alabasters. As far as St. John's head specifically, we do know that, especially in France, where they were trying to underscore the authenticity of their relic and specifically the wound in the brow, they used these St. John's heads in the plays. Some of them are specifically hollowed out to make them lighter to carry. For this purpose, English alabasters have yet to really be shown to fit into that, and it's something I'm continuing to look at. But there's definitely an understanding of these medieval alabasters to some extent having an interaction with mystery plays.
Right. Yes. Very good. Think you. Yes. You've obviously thought about all these things.
Not enough yet. So thank you for spurring me on.
I think we're almost at the end, but I was always also thinking, before I forget, in terms of the aesthetics of the alabaster and the relation to the Eucharist. So we're talking about blood and stone. There are, of course, many, metaphorical levels on which to talk about this, but also Petrarchism with the, this is the height of Petrarchism really in lyrical writings, and the way that the white and the red are played against white, red, gold, are played out against one another in Petrarchism, as well as the metaphors of the stone, the tension between living and dead in the stone, and the comparison to the body, the female body in that. But it just occurred to me that that might be another foil, another background for more aesthetic preferences.
Right. In terms, can I come in?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. In terms of the literature, I wonder whether it's worth looking at Thomas Wyatt.
Yes.
Because as an English poet who is very much imitating Petrarch, who's writing just at this time. I don't know. That's probably a red herring, but they're good. They're great poems anyhow.
Yeah.
They flee from me that sometime did me seek. Suggesting the how perilous that whole time around in the Reformation time was. Anyhow, that's
wonderful. Thank you both.
So is a poetic quote a good way of wrapping this up, Catherine? Is it?
Absolutely. I can't respond in verse, but yes. That's wonderful. So thank you all of you. Thank you to Chloe and to Rebekkah. Thank you, Jeanette. Thank you for all these questions and this rich conversation. We are very grateful, and I hope that this is a nice way to end your work week, and that you have a wonderful weekend, and that when I next see you, it is in the flesh, in person. But even if it's over Zoom, I will be glad to see you again. So thank you all, and we will be in touch again. Thank you.
Thank
you, Catherine, for having this great idea of doing something like this.
Well,
might be coming out.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.